So if we go back, I'm going to rush through this, the history, 1,000 years in 2 minutes, but if we look at Aristotle, he actually commented that nature has made all things specifically for the sake of man, and he regarded the value of non-human things as merely instrumental. So that is rooted firstly in a sort of Greek approach, but if you fast forward even to the 19th century, 18th, 19th century, Immanuel Kant, in a treatise on duties towards animals and electroethics, commented that animals are not self-conscious and are there merely as a means to an end, and that end is man. Our duties towards animals are merely indirect. He actually commented that cruelty towards a dog is not bad per se, but it's only bad because it could inculcate in that person the ability to be cruel towards humans, and regarded them only as a lower order with no rights in themselves. If we then look at the way that the Bible's even been interpreted, there's this concept of subduing the earth, be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth and subdue it to have dominion over the fish of the sea and the fowl of the air. The Bible is open to interpretation. This is the way it's been interpreted, and certainly in the colonial period it was combined with the social injustice of the rape of Africa, colonialism, and the rape of the environment together. But it developed in Western thought to what we really have now, which is a narrow social contract attitude towards the environment, which is that we do not inherit the earth from ancestors, but we borrow it from our children. It sounds nice, but it's limited in the sense that it really only looks at the utilitarian concept of nature as being something there for us to use, and our responsibilities towards it are only really to protect it for the sake of, at the very least, the future generations. And even that's been criticised by a lot of political economists who have argued that future generations lie outside of the moral community, so therefore there's no reciprocal relationship with them. They can't do anything for us, so why should we do anything for them? So it's arguable that within a Western philosophical setting, there is no real raison d'etre, there's no real reason for us to be protecting the environment per se. And I would argue that a religious ethic is needed, whether it's a Christian, Jewish, certainly within Christianity, St. Augustine and St. Thomas Aquinas were both very much concerned with the environment and wrote treatises and commentaries on protection of animals and the rights of animals. I'll look at this within an Islamic context and just give you a few of the verses from the Quran which really underpin this for me, certainly. So, if we look at the conception of nature in Islam, this was summarised as three main points. Firstly, as a reflection of God, ayat Allah. The Quran constantly has the refrain that you should look at nature, look for the signs of God in nature, the ayat Allah fil khalq. So firstly, it's as a reflection of the majesty of God, but also sharing in that eternal soul of the Creator. A collection of signs of ayat, of the power and goodness of God to stimulate our intellect, but lastly, to meet the basic needs, as in the verse that Imran mentioned, where we recognise that all communities of animals have their own rights, intrinsic rights, in a co-evolutionary situation. So those are the three aspects, and that's drawn from many verses, but a very fundamental, important one, which I should have done in white. Do not those who reject faith see that the heavens and the earth were joined together as one unit of creation before we exploded them into existence? When we made all living things of water, will they not then believe? So ultimately, there's a unity of creation, wahdat al-wujud, as it's known in the Arabic. We all come from the same source. As Imran mentioned, there is no animal that lives on the earth, nor a being that flies, but form parts of communities like unto yourselves. We live by cause and effect in an interdependent relationship. But what is it then that distinguishes mankind from that? So yes, we all come from the same thing. There's the breath of God in everything around us. We have to respect and take care and nurture. What is the essential difference? The essential difference is free will, self-reflection, self-awareness. Mankind has the ability to look at our situation and to make conscious decisions about what we do. And that ultimately is intimately connected with the whole idea of the fall from the garden, from Eden, our place on earth, and our responsibility, the journey of each individual soul, to strive to return to that garden. And in fact, the metaphor of the garden there is very important. We're talking about an environment, a perfect environment. So our role on earth is to return to that state, to actually integrate to the will of God and to return back to the garden. And that's where we get this term Khalifa, which is used in the Quran a lot. Allah says, "He it is that has made you his representatives on earth. Whosoever subverts this trust does so to the harm of his own soul." So we have a station above the rest of creation, but only by dint of us actually taking that responsibility seriously, by showing some form of stewardship or control over our relationship with the external world. And there's a proviso in that. There's another verse that says, "We have indeed created mankind in the most perfect constitution, but then lowered him to the lowest of the low, except those who believe and do good deeds." So, in a sense, yes, because we have a free will, we can say, yes, we are above the rest of creation in that sense that we have a responsibility to nurture and look after the environment. If we abdicate that responsibility, we're actually lower than the rest of creation. So be careful with that one about thinking about humans being superior. By current standards, we are probably actually failing, and we revert back to the lowest of the low in that sense. So nature is a blessing in our hands. God has spread the earth for us. We're told to eat of the good things and do good deeds, for surely God knows that which we do. And when it comes to the term halal, which is sadly misunderstood, and part of the reason why we got into farming ourselves was we were aware of the nature of the food that we're consuming, whether that's vegetables or meat. It's all being produced with unacceptable conditions in terms of animal welfare, but also in terms of the types of chemicals, pesticides, herbicides that are being used to produce the food that we're eating. In the Quran, there's a definition for you if you want to know what halal means. The Quran says, "They have asked you what is halal. Say to them, all that is pure and natural is halal." So pure, natural, tayyib, it means organic, naturally produced. So it's quite simply there in the Quran that we should actually understand that what we're currently doing is well beyond that. And there are many hadith, many sayings, which I'll skip over a few of these, but the Prophet himself, as Imran alluded to, was known to ensure that animals were treated well, not overburdened, treated kindly, that water was distributed fairly, that actually the protection of water resources was very important in Medina at that time. All of these issues give us indications of how we should be addressing the current problems that we're facing. But most importantly, that there's a balance, there's a natural balance. Again, a verse from the Quran, "And the heavens he has raised, and he has set therein a balance, by ordering that. Do not exceed the limits of that balance, and establish the balance in a just manner, and do not destroy the balance." Sadly, in the Arabic it sounds poetic, in the English it sounds clumsy, but you see the word balance is mentioned there, I think, 5 times, to stress that there is a natural order, a natural balance. I'm going to whiz through and actually just quote from a text that affected me very, very much, from a time that in fact was maybe a sort of gold standard of Muslim society, the 12th century in Muslim Spain, where we established highly sustainable, ecologically sustainable agricultural systems, but also socially sustainable systems. The oldest still extant democratic institution in Europe is in fact the water law courts that were established under the Muslim rule in Spain. So even the concept of democracy in Europe was first introduced at that period in Spain, it could be argued. There was a book written in the 12th century by a Muslim scholar, Ibn Tufayl, and it was called Hay ibn Yaqzan, the story of Hay ibn Yaqzan, a character. Translated into English, it was called The Journey of the Soul. And it describes this Robinson Crusoe type character who's cast on a shore of a desert island as a baby. He grows up nurtured by a deer. He suckles from that deer. He grows. He starts to contemplate and think, where did he come from? What created him? He recognizes a power behind everything he sees. He sees a unity in the creation. And he comes to understand that his purpose is to recognize that creator and in some sense to serve that creator through a natural theology. And then he looks at the food he's eating and says, well then, what are my rights in terms of the food that I eat? He says, if sufficient variety were available, he would select only those things whose destruction by him would offer the least opposition to the intention of the creator. For example, ripe fruit whose seed would still be available to reproduce their kind. A fruitarian back in the 12th century. If quantities of this sort of sustenance were insufficient, he would then use either fruit whose seeds themselves provide nutrition, or vegetables which had not reached the limit of their growth. And he would be careful not to destroy the roots or the seed. And if none of the foregoing is available, he would allow himself to draw upon animals, being careful not to impact upon species. As for the quantity he would permit himself, he decided it would be just enough to assuage the pangs of hunger. So that's an early statement of an Islamic environmental ethic. And I'll give you another quote at the end, actually. So how are we doing with that? I mean, how is the Muslim world differing then now from the contemporary Western experience? Very little, in fact. We find plenty of stuff happening around us. Sea level rise, CO2 levels, changing hydrological patterns, extreme weather fluctuations, floods, droughts, energy needs which are unsustainable, deforestation, soil degradation, pollution. All of this is happening around us. And again, a verse in the Quran which was quite prophetic for its time. Pollution has appeared on the land and the sea as the result of what man's hands have wrought, so that he may let them taste something of that which they have earned, and in order that they would turn back in repentance. So that's the situation that we're in. In 2015, the Global Sustainability Institute described a collapse of global food production systems by 2040. And in this scenario, they said global society would essentially collapse as food production falls permanently short of consumption. But again, as Imran alluded to, this is an issue of distribution and consumption patterns rather than overall production. Because not only have we enslaved and raped the environment, we're also enslaving populations across the world. The enforced extraction of surplus under capitalism, the continuous growth demanded by capitalism, is being taken both from people and the environment. And there's a verse in the Quran, they would say to you that trade is like usury or interest. But God has made trade beneficial, but has forbidden the charging of interest. One, interest engenders abuse, debt, slavery, resource degradation, whereas the other encourages shared risk, ownership, resource management. So interest versus the concept of profit sharing, stability against the concept of continual growth. So we're told there's scarcity, but what is the... Okay, we've got a few slides here I might need to get by. Currently, what are we eating? 50% of all the crops that we're growing at the moment are diverted for animal feed. We all know that the conversion of protein to grains and then from animals to humans is highly inefficient. Global food production could be almost doubled simply by changing the sort of diet that we're eating, enough to feed a further 4 billion people. But the consumptions are also an issue. What about the levels of inequality? The consumption levels in the West are around 4,000 calories a day, higher in certain countries in the Gulf, yet as low as 1,500 calories a day in much of Africa. With more equal consumption, we could be feeding a further 3 billion. And waste, let's look at waste. In developed economies, it's estimated that 30% of all food produced is lost between the production and the supermarkets. And in Western households, it's estimated that around 25% of all food is wasted in the household. And those figures are 10 times the waste levels in Asia and Africa. The global volume of food wastage is estimated at 1.6 billion tonnes. The carbon footprint of that wasted food is 3.3 billion tonnes of CO2. And the total volume of water used to produce food that we waste is equal to that of the flow of the River Nile. 1.4 billion hectares of land, over 20% of the available agricultural area, is used to produce food that is lost or wasted. So quite simply, we're eating too much, we're consuming too much, and we're wasting over a third of what we produce. And all of this has been made possible by an assault on the environment leading it to the edge of collapse. In a study in 2015 by the UN, not exactly known as a radical organization, they argued that such a collapse is imminent and due to an inequality-induced famine rather than a collapse of nature. And interestingly, they noticed 3 possible outcomes of this: increasing environmental crises, breakdown of state and social order in poorest economies, war and poverty causing a mass flow of refugees, and that Western democracies will turn increasingly to populist fascism. Nearly all three of those are coming to be true as we exist now. Across the world, 7 billion people, 1 billion of whom live in abject poverty on less than $1.50 a day. A further billion live below poverty, the poverty line, and are malnourished, so 2 billion below the poverty line, yet around 2 billion are suffering health issues related to overconsumption and obesity. Just a few final figures. In 2013, the richest 85 people owned half of the wealth, the richest 85 owned as much as the poorest half of the world. In 2015, that was 62 persons. In 2017, 8 people owned as much as half of the world's population. And interestingly enough, in 2019, the wealth of the richest 500 grew by 25% more. Currently, the richest 10% own 85% of the global wealth, and 30% of the population of the world own 97% of the world's wealth. And we are that 30%. We're the 30% in the developed economies. So there's a big issue of social justice alongside that of environmental justice. That's what I really want to stress. The challenge of saving the Earth may well seem impossible. It may even be impossible. The fact that all of us will die, the fact that the world will end, is actually a given. It's more a question of the individual spiritual journey, what we do with our time in the conditions that we're facing. And it's a journey of reconnecting of what's really of value to us, reconnecting with family, communities, and with the land, how we act as individuals. And there's a simple saying of the Prophet, peace be upon him, ad-din mu'amala, your religion is your social interaction. You choose where you put your activities. But the problem with our modern consumerist culture is we're all too often separated from those methods of production. We don't recognize our responsibilities. We're not aware of the impact of the clothes we're wearing or the food that we're consuming. So how do we get reconnected to those things? We've been stripped of our humanity and our compassion. If we look briefly at food, if we look at food production, I'm just going to very briefly look at 3 aspects of food production, of what we do on the farm in a way. The food production, how we deal with waste, and how we deal with the energy issue. Just as 3 ways of saying, well, all of us can at least look at those. We can do an audit of how we're doing in terms of the food we eat, the waste we produce, and the energy we consume. In terms of our food, modern production treats animals like commodities. Some of you may have seen these sort of pictures. It strips us of our humanity, of our compassion. If we were aware of the cruelty and suffering being carried out in our names, if we knew the cocktails of chemicals being used to produce our foods, if we could see the environmental destruction of our modern food networks, if we knew all of this, we wouldn't accept it in our name. If we personally had to abuse the animals, or if we personally had to destroy the environment, few of us would accept factory farmed foods, yet in our inaction, we reinforce the social relations that make up the modern food production systems. When you shop through your supermarkets, when you buy in your high street clothes shops, you're reinforcing the sort of slave labor relationships, whether it's in Bangladesh, or the food production systems, whether it's poultry houses such as this that you can barely see the end of in dark, squalid conditions. Some of my favorite pictures here is the next one, in fact. This one I find amazing. Can anyone guess what that actually is? That's a cattle ranch in America. The tiny little dots that you probably can't see in the boxes are the cattle. And what you see there is a pond of the slurry, the effluent, coming off that. So that's all the toxic slurry coming off these cattle lots, where cattle are kept in permanent pens, effectively the same as factory farmed chickens. The slurry seeps into these lagoons, dries off in the hot environment, and then falls as acid rain on communities in the region around it. And that's the sort of the result, a lifestyle where we think anything's available and we can eat meat day long. So we'll contrast that a little bit with what we're doing on the farm. If you want to learn a little bit more about what we do, come and visit us. We're open throughout the year, certainly during the better months. We encourage our animals to live naturally, to roam on the land, to live a happy life. And We also grow all of our vegetables organically. We reuse in a sort of closed system. The manures and the fertilizers that come from the animals go back to feed our vegetables and vice versa with the residues from the crops. So the first thing is food. Second is the issue, some of our produce, is the issue of waste. Sorry, actually, just on the issue of food, it is about community, and that's why I've got that slide there, to remind me. If you're going into Lidl's, or if you're going to buy from Primark, or even if it's Next or wherever, you're buying into a system of mass production, and that mass production involves a lot of abuses along the line that you're not aware of. We're selling directly to our customers. We have a small number of customers locally, we have some from further afield, but by and large they get to know us, they know what we're doing, they come and see how we're producing the meat, and they can hand on heart say that they know what's happening all the way down the line, right back to the little chicks that you saw earlier. And I think that's really important. That's your deen, that's your mu'amala, that's your social interaction. If you choose that social interaction, if you make an effort to gravitate towards what's happening around you that's in a positive vein, that's the right thing to do. If instead you're oblivious to it and you don't try and find out, well then you've made your choice, whether you realize you've made that choice or not. So that's a very important point. We have a lot of open days on the farm. We've made a little play area in the woodland. We have people come and visit us. We want to get them involved with what we're doing. We want to encourage people to make changes in their lifestyle. And all of that is part and parcel of the sort of movement that we're trying to encourage and the sort of changes we want to see in the next generation of people in the UK, really, to actually tackle these issues. Moving on to waste. Well, I think we've all seen landfill sites. If you haven't, you should go and see one. They're amazing. I drive past one occasionally on the M4 towards Bristol, and it's just acres upon acres of land where all of your stuff goes, everything that's in the bins here, everything that's sadly single-use plastics, all the sort of items that we shouldn't be handling. This is where they end up. On the farm, we're making an effort to recycle everything right down to the poo that's left with us. Anyone that comes to our farm and uses our compost toilets, it's recycled, and we turn that into a compost which we can use on the land. We've also tried to build sustainably. Over the years we've been on the farm, we've built simple timber buildings, learning how to do those, and then we moved on and did something a bit more elaborate. I used to work in Africa occasionally and saw a lot of mud buildings. I thought that looks easy enough. We built ourselves a large farmhouse using the clay taken directly from the land. Again, a communal project. You can compare that to the sort of industrial production with a lot of materials that are not sustainable. Everything in that building came from within, most of it came from within 2 meters of the house itself. It was mined directly from the ground. Things like the thatch were grown locally by a friend of ours who grew the traditional thatching wheat. And that's the material a bit closer up. So that's an example. But in terms of our heating as well, just the very last point is our energy use. We all use too much fossil fuel. I think we're all aware of that. We need to take that seriously. We need to look at how we heat ourselves over the winter. We've put in a wood-burning system. We've planted about 6,000 trees on the farm, and we have a sustainable offtake of timber providing all of our heating needs. The good thing about it is you have to load the boiler. You have to kick your children out early in the morning and say, go and load the boiler or split the wood. But you're aware of what you're doing. And if it's actually warm enough to put on a jumper, you'll put on a jumper and you take it seriously. You don't use that extra heat. In the sort of existence you live in, urban settings, it's all too easy to flick a switch and get the heat straight away, but it's coming from gas pipelines pumped across from Russia in areas of Siberia where they're displacing indigenous communities who used to reindeer herd across the Siberian plains but are now located in mass housing developments in these gas development cities. So there's so much that you don't know about what's going on about the energy sources that you're consuming. Here we're trying to make a small effort to say, well, we want to know exactly. We want to actually split our wood, burn our wood, plant our trees and harvest. We also have solar and wind technology on the farm, which is providing a large proportion of our electricity needs. Now, these are only small efforts that we're making. Obviously, there's a lot that people can do. I'll just finish on one simple quote, which I think is really important. This was from 12th century Baghdad at the time of the Abbasid Empire. And again, another parable written by a community called the Ikhwan as-Safa. It was a philosophical religious community. And they wrote a parable about man's treatment of animals. The animals came to complain to a judge saying that we've been treated badly. And he took their case on and he looked at their complaints. and man came and put their case, and they said, well, look, they're beasts of burden, they're for us to use. And he adjudicated, and he came up with this conclusion. He actually judged in favour of the animals. By the grace of God, I find myself in favour of the animals, for they have been sorely tested and abused. And he advised mankind to change their ways, to treat the animals with respect, to look after the water resources. And prophetically, he commented at the end of the treatise, should you err, the animals will begin to disappear one by one forever from the face of the earth, and the air in your settlements and fortresses will become dangerous to breathe, and the seasons will be reversed and your climates turned on end. The animals you eat will bring sickness and death upon you, and you will no longer rule the earth. This can be reversed, but humans have to realize the extent of their cruelty. Okay, I'll finish on that. As I say, really, the choice is yours. You have to assess where you are in this. We might not change the world, but change yourself, change those around you, and head in the right direction.